From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. Well, President Trump has been speaking today at the Economic Club of New York, at least virtually. He had a lot to say about the plans he has for the economy. But one of the things he addressed also was the need for stimulus, saying we need it at least for certain targeted industries, and he wishes that the Democrats would just loosen up a little bit. To talk about the state of the U.S. economy and the need for stimulus, we welcome now Michael Gapin. He's Barclays' chief U.S. economist. Michael, always a delight to have you with us. Give us your sense of where the U.S. economy is and how badly do we need this fiscal stimulus? Because right now, I tell you, I'm not sure we're getting it.
Thank you for having me on, David. It's always good to be with you. I think getting fiscal stimulus ahead of the election is a virtual non-starter. It doesn't seem like it's going to happen. Where we are in the U.S. is the economy is slowing. Signs of deceleration are obvious and clear. Now, most of us expected that growth would be slowing around this time following the sharp snapback in activity. Is a phase 4 package necessary? Yes, I think it is. I think the economy can get by without it until after the election. And I think either administration is going to bring forward fiscal stimulus plans. I think we can make it to there, but I think it's necessary as long as we get it in, say, the next 1 to 2 quarters. I think the recovery will be okay. But in the meantime, things are decelerating, and a delay in ongoing negotiations and stimulus doesn't really help things. So I think it hurts confidence. It slows down economic momentum, and it prevents a fuller and quicker recovery in the economy.
And, Michael, as you know, there's this continuing back and forth among 3 parties, really, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the Senate Republicans and Nancy Pelosi representing the Democrats. So it's hard to know where we're going here. But beyond the question of how big the package is, there also seems to be a disagreement about whether it needs to be targeted or general. Can we get what we need for the economy if it's targeted on things like the airlines that the president mentioned and maybe small business and getting some money to people's pockets if it doesn't address, for example, broad state assistance?
Well, I think getting anything is better than getting nothing for sure. So even if it were targeted on specific sectors like airlines, as you mentioned, and maybe small business, that's better than doing nothing. Now, obviously, as you mentioned, there are 3 parties, and the parties here have to give. So I think moving in all directions is probably the way to get a bill done, which would mean you need to include something for state and local governments as well. They've been hit hard. The revenue side of states has been hit very hard by the pandemic. So the more targeted it is, I think the less likely it has chance of passing, although it would be helpful for the economy. I think you have to tick all the boxes to get a bill over the finish line, and that's where things are getting stuck.
So, Michael, you're an economist. I'm not going to hold you accountable for the equity markets, but if you can square something up for me, most economists we talk to say just what you say, which is we need to get more fiscal stimulus, that in fact the recovery is slowing down in the United States. We need more help. But in the meantime, if you look at the equity markets, they don't seem to reflect that. What do the equity markets see that you economists don't see?
I think the equity. So my interpretation, you're right. I'm an economist, not a strategist. My interpretation is that the equity market is taking a longer view, and I think on balance, the equity market thinks we will get fiscal stimulus. We may not get it now, but we're likely to get it next year. Now, the composition of that stimulus could differ depending on whether it's a Republican-led administration or a Democratic one. But I think one of the assumptions the equity market is making is we will get it. It may come in Q2 of next year instead of Q4 of this year, but it's likely forthcoming. And the second thing I would say is, the S&P 500 isn't necessarily representative of the overall economy. And as I think we all know, COVID hits very small business hard. But some of the winners in a COVID landscape are the big tech companies that dominate the index. So I wouldn't say the equity market is the economy, and I think the particular way in which COVID has affected certain parts of the economy and very small business in particular, you can get a bit of a disagreement between the economic data and the equity market pricing.
In the president's remarks to the Economic Club just a few minutes ago, he addressed also the question of infrastructure and taxes in a second term if he gets a second term. Talk first about infrastructure. We kept hearing about that all of his first term. We never got it done. President Trump today said that's the Democrats' fault. How much would that be an assistance to the U.S. economy if, in fact, we did get a substantial infrastructure bill next time, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House?
Look, from an economic perspective and the point of view of an economist, an infrastructure plan, I think, would be very helpful because it's a direct injection of government spending into the economy. It would likely be very large and multi-year in length, and it would anchor the growth outlook, in my opinion, and reduce uncertainty about the growth outlook. And it could therefore be catalytic to business spending and business hiring in a way that tax cuts are not. As you know, that there was a big debate in the last recovery about whether tax cuts just went to share buybacks or did they indeed boost business investment and hiring. So I think a multi-year infrastructure package could be very important in terms of nailing down the growth path. And if it were complemented by things like the expansion of broadband or investments into education, it could also lift the long-run potential growth rate of the economy. So yes, we do need emergency assistance in terms of fiscal spending for the pandemic, but over the medium term, I think an infrastructure component with some things on education would be very helpful for the long-run performance of the U.S. economy.
So infrastructure perhaps more valuable than tax cuts. What about the reverse of tax cuts, and that is increased taxes? Because, again, the President of the United States today, in talking to the Economic Club in New York, really did, I'll say, a tap dance on the Democrats, saying if they get elected, they're going to really raise your taxes. What could that do to the economy if, in fact, those taxes are used for investments such as in infrastructure?
Well, I would say that, so the magnitude here would be the is the unknown question. Do you seek to pay for all of the spending package with tax cuts, or are you saying, well, we maybe will pay for a third of it or 40% of it? So I think that it's the netting of the two that would matter. In the short run, revenue raisers may dampen economic activity. There's no question about that. But if they are combined with a multi-year, kind of multi-trillion-dollar spending package, it would be hard to argue that on net it would be a negative for the economy. So some of the issue there is timing, about when raising revenue happens versus when it's spent and influences economic activity. But I still think on net, a Democratic proposal that has some higher taxes but also comes along with increased federal spending, that on net that's likely to be supportive of the outlook.
So, Michael, finally, as an economist, what do you put in as your base case for the virus? Because the virus is maybe one of the biggest economic factors we have.
That's right. It is. In my view, it's the number one thing that either administration will have to deal with next year. We have to get control of the COVID-19 pandemic. Otherwise, the economy is going to run on three wheels and not four. Our outlook is we've been becoming a little more optimistic about the likelihood for a vaccine. It does appear to us that a vaccine will be approved by the end of the year and available for widespread distribution in the U.S. next year. That's a little earlier than we had thought previously. So I'd say we're cautiously optimistic on that front. If that does indeed turn out to be the case, it could allow for a faster restoration of lost services output and therefore put the U.S. economy on a firmer track to recovery.
Michael, it's always great to have you with us. That's Michael Gapin. He is the chief U.S. economist at Barclays. And now it's time for a check on the markets. And joining us today is Abigail Doolittle. It looks a little bit risk-off to me. What is it, Abigail?
It certainly does, David. And the day is getting interesting because earlier stocks were basically flipping between very small gains and losses. But now we have more sizable losses. The S&P 500 down right now about 0.4%. Moments ago, down about 0.6%. The NASDAQ 100 down more. Before getting to what's behind those losses, though, take a look at where we have the outperformance for the Dow transports, the airlines higher. We also have oil higher. So that is some indication that there's some hope that some sort of stimulus is going to get done. On the other hand, at the Milken event, you have Steven Mnuchin talking about the idea that getting a deal done before the election could be very difficult. So the markets seem to be taking that poorly. From a granular or a stock level perspective, David, Amazon.com seems to be the big weight, at least on the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ, trading near session lows down about 1.9%. Its worst day in a week. And this, of course, on the second day of its Prime Day event. So perhaps some chatter coming out that there's weakness there. We don't know that. But when you see the stock sell off so sharply on the day, you question that possibility at least. And then finally, we, of course, have started off the earnings season. It right now is going to the bears. Goldman Sachs is trading higher. They put up a big quarter on trading. Bank of America, on the other hand, trading was disappointing. That stock down sharply. And we also have Wells Fargo down even more. Their net interest income guidance not so inspiring, plus costs higher as they restructure amid job layoffs, David. So these bank earnings right now not coming in the way that the bulls would hope, and the market's reflecting that overall with modest declines for the major averages, David. So yes, a bit of a risk-off tone to your first point.
Okay, thank you so much, Abigail. Always a delight to have you. That's Abigail Doolittle reporting on the markets. Coming up later in the hour, we're going to have Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland on the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation hearings and the quest for fiscal stimulus. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. The Senate Judiciary Committee is getting one more day to ask questions of Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett. She's mostly resisted Democrats' efforts to pin her down on abortion rights, health care, and the upcoming election. Today, Judge Barrett was asked whether the president has the power to pardon himself. Barrett said she couldn't express an opinion on it because the issue may come before the court. She also said the Supreme Court can rule on a law, but it doesn't have the power to enforce it, even when applied to the president. President Trump and Democratic nominee Joe Biden won't debate each other, but they will be answering questions from voters at the same time. The two will hold dueling town halls tomorrow night. NBC News says it will host an event with the president, taking questions from voters in Miami. It'll come at the same time as an ABC News town hall with Joe Biden in Philadelphia. The president refused to take part in a virtual debate while he recovered from the coronavirus. Russia is continuing to see a record number of coronavirus cases. Officials reported 14,000 new cases today, the most since the beginning of the pandemic. Russia has the world's fourth largest COVID-19 caseload. Despite a surge in new cases, Russian authorities have dismissed suggestions of a second national lockdown. The European Union is unveiling new plans to help slow down global warming. They include a strategy to tackle highly polluting methane gas emissions and a plan to renovate millions of old buildings to make them more energy efficient. The European Commission is also laying out plans to restrict the use of dangerous chemicals in toys, cosmetics, and other products. The EU wants to slash greenhouse gas emissions to at least 55% of at least what they were in 1990 over the next decade. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Judge Amy Coney Barrett is in her third and final day of confirmation hearings, as Mark just told us. We welcome now one of those who will ultimately vote on her for Supreme Court Justice. He is Senator Ben Cardin, Democrat of Maryland. So, Senator, thank you so much for joining us. And so we've had 2 days. We're in our third day now of hearings. Have you seen or heard anything that will change anyone's mind, whether yours or someone else's?
Quite frankly, I don't think so. The first issue is the hypocrisy of this hearing altogether and this nomination this close to the election, and Republicans playing by different rules than the Democrats were required under their leadership with President Obama's appointment of Merrick Garland. So there's the hypocrisy in this appointment. And then secondly, I think it's quite clear that Judge Barrett's views in regards to the Affordable Care Act and the challenges that will present for those with pre-existing conditions or caps, that the Democrats are very committed to protecting the Affordable Care Act. And there was nothing that was said during this hearing that would alleviate those concerns.
At the same time, is there any question about her competence or her qualifications for the job?
I don't think we've really gotten there. There's some concerns about some of her writings, some of her views as it relates to the Affordable Care Act, some of her views as it relates to women's right of choice. Those issues are clearly areas of concern. But the two hurdles that we can't get over is first the legitimacy of this appointment, considering the rules that were applied to President Obama, and then secondly, President Trump's stated desire in making this appointment to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. He said he wouldn't appoint a judge to the Supreme Court unless they followed these orders. So it just seems like there's just too much concern about the impact the president is trying to have on the courts rather than having an independent justice.
Senator Cardin, I want to turn to something else that I know is important to you, and that is the stimulus, the proposed fiscal stimulus that doesn't seem to be going anywhere right now. You've been fairly outspoken in the need for it, particularly when it comes to state assistance, also some help to schools in the state, your home state of Maryland. Is there any question that we really need fiscal stimulus, more fiscal stimulus right now in this country?
Oh, we desperately need it. There's no question. We've needed it for months. When we passed the CARES Act in March, we anticipated that COVID-19 would be over by now and our economy would be back on track. That's certainly not the case. We needed a bill passed. The House did their work in mid-May. They have repeated that action more recently with a version that's closer to what the numbers that the president wanted. We should have had a second round of COVID relief well before now. It's desperately needed for small businesses. It's needed for state and local government. It's needed for our schools. It's needed for homeowners and renters. We've got to get it done. It should have been done long before now. And it's clear to me that the president's not interested in this other than the politics on his election. And the Republicans in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, won't bring up a bill that would do the work.
Well, let me ask you that question, because the president yesterday tweeted that, in fact, we should go big or go home when it comes to stimulus. He's sent some messages, conflicting messages, but he sent some messages. He wants to have a big stimulus bill. If the president were to go forward and Secretary Mnuchin worked something out with Speaker of the House Pelosi, do you believe it could be gotten through the Senate with some of the Republican senators and the Democratic senators joining some of the Republicans?
Yes, I think it could, but Mitch McConnell won't let that happen. Let's be clear. Mitch McConnell is not going to bring a bill to the floor of the Senate that would pass by Democratic votes without a majority of Republicans voting for it. And he doesn't have the majority of his caucus in regards to what the president is saying. So yes, I think the votes are there, but look at hundreds of bills that could have been enacted by now that Mitch McConnell has not brought to the floor of the United States Senate. So I think it's highly unlikely that scenario will take place.
One of the things, Senator Cardin, you know well that Speaker of the House Pelosi has been saying we need this bill in part to fight the COVID virus itself. You have an interesting position that you've taken, as I understand, with your colleague, Marco Rubio, saying, you know, it's not just U.S. we should be worried about. We should also be worried about fighting this virus around the world because it is global. We can't stop it at our borders.
Exactly. The COVID relief package needs to deal with the international aspects as well as domestic aspects. We still have not done our work at home, and we got to take care of our needs here in America. And we need to lead by example. And our example is not one in which the world is saying we want to follow. But then we also have to recognize that this is a global pandemic. And until it's controlled globally, we're still at risk here in America. So yes, we have made it clear that we need to include international aspects to our response to this pandemic.
Senator Cardin, if it's not to be done, this fiscal stimulus before the election, let's talk about after the election. Do you anticipate perhaps there would be a significant stimulus bill, whether it's a President Biden or a President Trump coming in the lame duck session?
You know, it's difficult to make a prediction. I would have thought that by now we would have passed the next round of COVID relief. It's desperately needed. So yes, after the elections, I am optimistic. If we don't get it done before the elections, that we would recognize that relief is needed. State and local governments desperately need help. Our school systems desperately need help. Small businesses desperately need help. The airline industry needs help. And the list goes on and on and on. The sooner we get it done, the better. If it's not before the elections, I would hope, regardless of the outcome in the election, we would get it done in a lame duck session.
Do you anticipate that this will be a significant issue as voters go to the poll November 3rd?
I think the COVID situation is first in their minds. So yes, I think the failure of the Trump administration to keep them safe, the failure of the Trump administration to get this pandemic under control, and the failure of the Trump administration to deal with the consequences of COVID-19 through additional relief bills will all be on the minds of our voters.
Okay, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you with us. That's Senator Ben Cardin, Democrat of Maryland. Still ahead here for our Stocks of the Hour, we're going to take a look at the big banks reporting Q3 earnings this week. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, the big banks are taking up the spotlight once again on earnings, but not market leadership, it turns out. Let's check in with Scarlet Fu. So as I say, they've been beating to some extent, but the stock market doesn't like it.
Yeah, stock market is kind of meh on them right now. Financials are in the middle of the pack when it comes to sector leadership. It is day 2 of the big bank earnings, and we had Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo all reporting. One of the big themes for banks since the pandemic began is how volatile markets have led to big gains for their trading desks. And Goldman Sachs posted a near 30% jump in trading powered by fixed income currencies and commodities revenues surging almost 50%. That helped lift its EPS to a record high. We saw JP Morgan and Citigroup yesterday report at least 17% trading gains. We'll see how Morgan Stanley stacks up when it reports tomorrow. At Bank of America, you could see that 4% increase. Trading was fairly underwhelming. CEO Brian Moynihan chalked it up to the firm not taking on the same risk as rivals, even though he said every trading day was profitable for that division. Now, gains in trading revenue help compensate for difficult conditions overall in the lending business, which leads to the second big theme, banks setting aside money for potential bad loans. That has become less of an issue in the third quarter. They were extra aggressive in the first half of the year. And as a result, more money gets to flow to the bottom line in the third quarter. Wells Fargo setting aside around $700 million. That's compared with $9.5 billion in the second quarter. Of course, David, when you talk about Wells Fargo, it's got its own issues that are separate from provisioning for bad loans. It's got legacy issues that the other big banks don't. It's got the fake account scandal and also a Federal Reserve cap on its assets. And it ended up with some $1.7 billion in charges linked to the scandal and reducing headcount.
So, Scarlett, one thing you didn't mention was wealth management. And when you talk about wealth management, I at least think about Morgan Stanley, which we haven't heard from yet. They haven't absorbed Eaton Vance. They've announced they want to buy it. But are we getting any indication of how wealth management is doing or what that might mean for Morgan Stanley?
Well, wealth management is one of the areas that Morgan Stanley has counted on ever since the great financial crisis to provide some stability to its earnings and to also give it some margin when it couldn't count on stable results from its trading operations. And we expect to see that to be the case again going forward. And in fact, Goldman Sachs has actually shifted in that direction as well, away from just focusing merely on trading and investment banking and looking to shore up its efforts in wealth management. So this is something that is going to continue to be a theme, but we are also looking for gains in trading here for Morgan Stanley as well after it's been very, very lucrative for the big banks thus far.
Yeah, Morgan Stanley's done well in equities, as I recall, typically.
Yes.
So thank you so much to Scarlett for that report on the markets. Up next, we're going to get more on bank earnings. This time we're going to talk with the Dean of Banking Regulation, Raj Cohen of Sullivan & Cromwell. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. It's looking less and less likely that there will be a new stimulus relief plan before the election. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell have dug into their opposing stances on pandemic relief. And Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin heads to the Middle East next week, which could delay further negotiations between Democrats and the White House. Today, he said getting a deal before next month's election, the upcoming election, will be difficult. Here in New York City, officials say they're making progress in curbing coronavirus infection rates in areas of Brooklyn and Queens where coronavirus cases have been spiking recently. Mayor Bill de Blasio said today there has been some leveling off in the so-called hot zones, but that more progress is needed to stop a second wave of COVID-19. Russia says it will respond in kind to the European Union's sanctions over the poisoning of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Doctors say Navalny, a fierce critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin, was poisoned with a Soviet-era nerve agent. Navalny says his poisoning couldn't have been ordered without President Putin's involvement, an accusation the Kremlin vehemently denies. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. The big U.S. banks have been reporting third quarter earnings this week, reflecting a generally improving economy, but also the weight of interest rates approaching zero. For some perspective on the banking industry today, we welcome now the Dean of Banking Regulation. He is Raj Cohen, Senior Chairman of Sullivan Cromwell. Raj, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Give us your sense of what we're seeing in the earnings and what they tell us about the state of the banking industry. As I say, typically bankers don't like interest rates near zero. Makes it hard for them to make money, but a lot of these banks are making money nonetheless.
Yes, David, and a pleasure as always to be here with you. I think you are seeing the consequence of several trends. Clearly, near zero interest rates represent a negative drag on bank earnings. You are also seeing markets which are productive in terms of trading revenue for the largest banks. You are also seeing a disconnect between large corporations and small businesses and consumers, which are struggling and which is really struggling. And that's where some of the drag is. And finally, and I think this has not yet been commented on, there's been a lot of notice of the sharp reduction in bank provisioning for reserves. To me, that is primarily a function of what should have been expected with the introduction of CECL, which exaggerates losses in the early stages of a problem, and then it's restored over time. So I think you could really measure this substantial difference in reserves and attribute it to CECL.
So I'm really glad you raised CECL, because we hear about CECL typically when we have Jay Powell go up and testify in front of Congress, and a number of Congress people will say, what about CECL? Explain to our viewers, and to me for that matter, exactly how it works. As I understand it, it basically requires a bank to sort of mark to market, looking out over the course of the loan, what the likely receipts will be.
Well, basically it says, what are your losses over the entire course of the loan, rather than your losses which are expected within a relatively short period of time. And so it does, in effect, accelerate possible losses in the loan portfolio. And Chairman Powell has no choice. All the bank regulators are obligated to follow GAAP. And the decision was made that GAAP should incorporate CECL.
But if that means you have to take the hit at the front end of the loan by projecting out, does that mean, in fact, there may be some good news down the road, particularly if, in fact, the losses aren't as large as you thought? It's sort of like taking a reserve. Maybe you don't need to use the whole reserve.
Absolutely. And I think if we are fortunate enough to have an economic recovery, I think you will see a fair amount of the CECL reserves established in Q1 and Q2 reversed.
So, Raj, as you know well, we've got now just 20 days away, we've got an election coming up, and we have two very different candidates in Joe Biden and Donald Trump. They differ on a lot of things. Do we have a sense of how they might differ with respect to bank regulation, how they treat the banks?
I don't know that we do. I somewhat jokingly say that on the list of 100 topics, if we had had 3 debates, bank regulation would not have been in the top 500. But the bottom line is, I think this is a function far more of the individuals who are at the top in the leadership positions of the key agencies. And the Federal Reserve in particular, Vice Chairman Quarles' term does not end until near the end of next year. Chairman Powell's term ends, I think, in early 2022. It's not immediate. So you may still have much of the same leadership. Similarly, Chairman McWilliams at the FDIC, her term does not expire for a period of time. So there may be more continuity than is expected, at least in the intermediate term.
We have heard from Senator Biden when he was senator, some remarks made that he is particularly concerned about the unbanked, the underbanked, maybe local, regional banks, CFIBs, things like that. Do we think that maybe that might make a difference, in fact, if there's more of an emphasis put on people who are relatively underbanked?
I think if the former vice president is elected, you're exactly right. There will be an emphasis, and frankly, there should be an emphasis on the underbanked and unbanked. We talk a lot about economic justice, and I think correctly so. And if you do not have access to the banking system, you are not going to be able to reach your economic potential. And so I think a focus there and by the industry itself is paramount today.
One of the things that could change is the CFPB, because now the Supreme Court said the president could basically fire the head of the CFPB if they want to. What might that mean, particularly for the credit card industry? Because after all, Joe Biden does come from a state that's very heavily invested in the credit card industry, that is Delaware.
Yes, I'm not sure until you know who will be there. I don't think the current chair of the CFPB has been a slacker, particularly in respect of enforcement. She has been willing to go after even large institutions. With respect to credit cards, interestingly enough, with all the various enforcement actions that have been taken, credit cards have not been a focal point by whether it was the Obama administration or the Trump administration. And maybe it's luck, but I suspect it's more that compliance is at a pretty high level, particularly with the major credit card issuers.
And finally, Raj, you mentioned briefly the issue of reserves taken against possible bad loans. I wonder whether that could affect the banks with respect to the stimulus bill. That in fact, if there's a large stimulus bill coming through, could that actually ease some of the pressure on some of the debtors in repaying their loans to the banks?
That's a great question, and it may. I do think one interesting issue is if we do not get a stimulus bill in the next few weeks or months, would the Federal Reserve and Treasury then reconsider the standards they have established for the large pieces of the CARES Act, which have not yet been fully implemented, Main Street lending in particular, and start to use some of that money in a more liberal way than has been the case today?
Okay, Raj, as I say, it really is a pleasure every time you're on. That is Rajan Cohen. He is Sullivan & Cromwell Senior Chairman. Coming up here, our swing state look at Florida continues as we welcome Democratic Congresswoman Kathy Castor of Tampa. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. All this week, we've been looking at Florida as part of our Swing State series leading up to the election. And welcome now Representative Kathy Castor of the 14th Congressional District, which contains pretty much all of the city of Tampa. So welcome, Congresswoman. It's good to have you with us. Give us your view of where Florida is in this election, and particularly your district in Tampa.
Well, it's good to be with you, David. Yes, every day is election day right now. Vote by mail returns are up. About 30% of everyone who has a vote by mail ballot has returned it here in Tampa, Hillsborough County. So that will continue. Early voting starts next week. So you'll continue to see folks weighing in and voting prior to Election Day. And we have a very good system of vote by mail. But what I'm hearing from folks, and I think what is driving the large vote by mail returns, is the coronavirus, COVID-19. We are averaging now well over 100 deaths per day here in the state of Florida. Folks are very concerned that here in the United States, we have the highest death rate out of all of the developed countries in the world. And this has impacted many small businesses, especially the leisure and hospitality sector and all of the businesses tied to that. So those are the front burner issues right now, controlling coronavirus and trying to operate your business safely and have schools operate safely as students have gone back or tried to handle instruction at home.
Congressman, as you look in your district, is this particularly hitting seniors and their voting? Now, I understand your median age is pretty young, actually, in Tampa. It's like 34, 35 years old. But we hear some reports out of Florida in general that seniors may be very concerned about this and therefore, let's be frank, perhaps inclined to vote for the former vice president rather than for President Trump.
You bet everyone is concerned. And in fact, in the Tampa Bay Times today, the largest circulation of all newspapers in the state of Florida, I was really struck. They had a section of page after page of our neighbors here in Florida who have lost their lives to coronavirus. Yes, they were trending older, but I was struck by folks in their 40s. 50s. They had a synopsis of their life story. Really, really sad tales. And now I think everyone has been touched in some way. They know someone, or they've had a family member who's been impacted, or the failure to control the coronavirus has led to economic fallout. They've lost their job. And they're wondering when is the United States of America going to get its act together to crush this virus and do the widespread rapid testing that we need to get this under control.
Congressman, another issue in this campaign is energy and energy policy, and you particularly have a leadership role in that, both in your on the subcommittee on energy and power of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, but also you're chair of the Select Committee on Climate Change. So give us your perspective of what the voters of your district care about when it comes to energy, particularly as you choose between a Vice President Biden and a President Trump.
Yeah, there couldn't be a more stark difference when it comes to environmental policy and action on the climate crisis. Here in Florida, you would think because we're the Sunshine State that we generate a lot of our electricity from solar power. That's not the case. We're still tied to fossil fuels. But folks now, they understand that clean energy can be less expensive. They've seen cost escalate due to climate impacts, whether that's their flood insurance, their property insurance, longer, hotter summers, so their air conditioning bills. These rapidly intensifying hurricanes now are having a they're costing lives and livelihoods. So folks know that clean energy is the future, and when Donald Trump and his administration rolls back environmental, clean air policy, clean water policy, everything related to climate, takes us out of the International Climate Accord, they know that that's the wrong course of action. And look, they're looking to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who have a very broad-based plan to transition to the clean energy economy and create jobs doing it. I think folks know it can be less expensive, but see enormous opportunities to create jobs, whether it's in resilience, making our water system, wastewater systems more resilient, our transportation system more resilient, or building the macro grid across the country to ramp up renewables.
Can we do all that without increasing the cost of energy to all of us?
I think so. I think after a year of study in my committee in the Congress, we issued a report that demonstrates we can make this transition. Folks know that clean energy can be a lot less expensive. And here's the fact. Folks used to think it would be expensive, but now the cost of climate are escalating. Like I said before, your property insurance, your the AC bills, all of that adds up, and they know that's kind of a canard now to think that the clean energy future will be a lot more expensive than what we're experiencing right now.
Finally, Congresswoman, you mentioned how many absentee ballots, mail-in ballots will be cast in Florida this year. How concerned should we all be election night that we won't be able to get an accurate count at least anytime soon? Because we're all going to be looking at Florida, let's be honest.
Florida actually has a very robust and experienced vote-by-mail situation. We can tabulate all of the vote-by-mail ballots prior to Election Day, so that will help ease the flood of ballots. So folks can look to Florida. Now, the Panhandle comes in an hour later in the next time zone, so you won't have all of Florida in. But early in the evening, when they tabulate and put up the vote-by-mail returns, you'll have a very good idea. But there are other states that have different deadlines. Our ballots have to be in by Election Day or they're not counted. unless you're a military service member overseas. Some other states have longer deadlines, and those might be the states that will wait for. But I think things are trending here. The failure of the Trump administration to control the coronavirus, its economic fallout, especially on small business owners. And here, I'm in Tampa. We won the Stanley Cup this year.
Yeah, congratulations.
The Tampa Bay Rays are likely headed to the World Series. And folks are quite angry that they cannot get out and celebrate. It's economically devastating that we can't host these big events in our arenas and attract tourists. That's our lifeblood. So don't underestimate the impact of the failure to control the coronavirus and the impact to our health on this election. I think that's one reason folks are voting early and in large numbers.
Fair point. Thank you so much. Really great to have you with us. That's Congresswoman Kathy Castor. She's Democrat of Florida. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. The New York Post published a report overnight that a laptop of Hunter Biden, that's the presidential candidate's son, revealed efforts by Hunter Biden to use his access to his father to benefit Burisma, the Ukrainian energy company on whose board he served. For an early read on what this may and may not mean for the Biden campaign, welcome now Bloomberg political contributor Jeannie Zaino. So even as I said that, Jeannie, it's a convoluted story, but it's something that the Trump campaign has been on for some time, including in the debate, the presidential debate.
Absolutely. We sat there while the president tried to hammer Joe Biden on this very question. And, now we see this big report out of the New York Post today that emails from a laptop that were recovered at a repair shop in 2019 and then seized by the FBI, apparently over 40,000, and then delivered to the lawyer of Rudy Giuliani. And today, of course, we've had Steve Bannon, another former Trump administration official, on the air talking about these and the seriousness of them. So, it is part and parcel, I think, of an attempt by the Trump administration to raise this issue and get people to focus on who Joe Biden is and whether, in fact, he and or his son have relationships with foreign governments, companies owned by foreign governments. And, of course, to make the case that Joe Biden lied to the media and the American public when he said he didn't know anything about his son's business dealings.
So I guess we have to condescend to particulars, as they say in this. We all knew that Hunter Biden was on the board of this Burisma, this energy company in Ukraine, and got paid a fair amount of money for it. And we all figured that basically he was there in part because he was the son of the vice president of the United States. That's not particularly a surprise. What new did we learn here? I guess it's that at least he tried maybe to introduce some official from Burisma to his father when he was vice president?
Yeah, that he tried to make the introduction while he was on the board, and of course also that Joe Biden, when asked directly whether in fact he knew anything about this, said he did not. So the veracity of Biden's claim that he had never spoken to his son or about his business dealings. I think those are the two big stories. The other thing they're talking about is whether the Biden family, Joe Biden and or the family, not only lied but potentially violated any regulations and whether they pose a national security threat because they have financial ties to other governments and companies owned by other governments across the world.
Now, as you reported, at least according to the report, former mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, had access to this laptop, which apparently was dropped off at a repair facility and never was picked up. As a practical matter, do we figure that maybe both campaigns have things stored up we might see over the next 20 days or so?
I think so. I think, this is going to be what we're going to see for the next 2-3 weeks, right? We have an incumbent president at a really difficult time, down in most of the polls. And so how can you change that narrative? This is one way. Certainly the last debate can certainly change the narrative if Joe Biden doesn't perform up to par. But, to shake up the race, it's going to be something like this out of both campaigns potentially. The Barr report that was going to come out of DOJ didn't come to fruition, so that was something of a bust, but there's been some suspicion talk that we may see something else either out of the Department of Justice or the State Department at this point, which raises the question about Joe Biden, his truthfulness, whether he's broken any regulations, these kinds of things that we're seeing in the Post today.
Listen, none of us can predict. I certainly can't predict how this all plays out. At the same time, if we compare it to 2016, when we had the revelations about Hillary Clinton and the FBI investigation, weren't there a lot more undecideds at this point in the campaign? At this point, it's a fairly low percentage of the voters who say they don't know who they're going to vote for.
Yeah, low percentage of undecideds. And of course, this time the president has a record. He is the president. He is the incumbent. We're in this unprecedented pandemic. The economy and everything else is impacted. And so people are looking at him. And anytime he is the one on the ballot and it's a referendum on him, he doesn't do particularly well. And that's just not about Donald Trump. Any incumbent president has to defend their record. So it's a lot more difficult to run as an incumbent than as a challenger like he did in 2016.
Finally, briefly, Jeannie, do we know that last debate's going to happen?
I would say yes, David, but I thought the second one was going to happen. I'm hopeful selfishly that it happens, but I also hope for the American public, because I think to have the ability at least one more time to hear these two men on the record, that one of whom is going to be president, is really important. But I guess we don't know at this point if one or both back out.
Fair enough. Okay, thanks so much to Jeannie Zaino, our Bloomberg political contributor. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we'll talk about the economy and stimulus with David Wilcox. He's Peterson Institute's senior fellow, former head of the domestic economics division at the Fed. And this is Bloomberg.